Okay. Great. So hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is AJ Morgan. I work with IOM as the advisor on peace and security based in our Geneva HQ. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable today, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what we're going to be able to discuss here. Now, the format of this roundtable is going to include a very brief couple minutes here in the beginning to introduce your panelists to you, followed by about 6 minutes of presentations by each of our panelists. Then we're going to enjoy about 30 minutes of questions and answers, so please do start thinking about the questions that you'd like to ask. And finally, we'll close with some brief remarks from each of our panelists, and I'll summarize for you the main points that we're going to take away from each of them. Now, the roundtable is going to help us discuss some of those more complex questions and difficulties that can arise from the lack of empirical data on the impact of international humanitarian peacebuilding development interventions on this climate conflict mobility link. It's also going to help us examine some of the potential impacts that such interventions can have and consider the role of efficient and sustainable resource governance practices in mitigating the risks associated with this link. The conversation is going to provide some insights into responding to challenges that are associated with the climate conflict mobility link and support the improvement of the design and implementation of interventions across the humanitarian development peace nexus, humanitarian peace development nexus, and achieve some durable solutions and enhance resilience in communities. Now, I said before that I do work with IOM, and IOM is continuing to try to expand its engagement on this particular link, with special consideration for the impacts that international humanitarian and development interventions are having on this particular climate conflict link. Now, in the coming year, we're looking to strengthen our leadership role from an operational perspective, work with partners while effectively integrating inclusive, conflict-sensitive, environment-sensitive, gender-sensitive, and context-specific policies and interventions. So in our continuous efforts to increase our engagement on this link, I'm pleased to be joined today by a fantastic panel in this roundtable. And we're going to start our conversation with Ollie Brown, who is an associate fellow with Chatham House and with the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Ollie is associated with the Climate and Security Expert Network and is a trustee for the Conflict and Environment Observatory. Salim, our speaker after Ollie, is the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor in Energy and Environment at the University of Delaware, a senior fellow at Columbia, a senior fellow at Columbia University Center on Sustainable Investment, and has extensive fieldwork experience in over 100 countries. Ollie and Salim's presentations on an upcoming report from the International Resource Panel will provide a segue to our conversation with Richard on the securitization of climate change. Richard is Professor of International and Environmental Politics in the Schools of Social Ecology and Social Science at the University of California at Irvine, and founding director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. We would then turn to the operational challenges of programming across the climate conflict migration link and hear from David Arnold and Molly Kellig. So David is currently the Regional Emergency and Post-Crisis Officer for IOM's regional office in the Middle East and North Africa. And Molly is a Gender, Climate, and Security Advisor at the UN Environment Program in Geneva. So having indicated the theoretical and operational challenges of the particular link, we're going to turn to our last speaker, Shayna, to discuss the Migration with Dignity framework. Shayna is the NASA Earth Science Division's Global Partnership Manager and the Program Coordinator for Socioeconomic Assessments. Now, for a bit of logistics before we begin, for questions, please type your questions in the chat box or use your raise hand function if you would like to share your questions directly with us. We will happily unmute you when you need to speak and request you to share your name and organizational affiliation when asking us questions. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. Please click on the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen if you would like to attend the session in French or Spanish. Once you enter an audio channel, you may mute the original audio if you would prefer. So with that, I will leave it over to Ollie to open us up. Thank you, everybody.
AJ, thank you so much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join you. I'm going to be Salim's wingman here, basically doing a lead-in for him to talk about the really important results of this international resource panel. And I guess I wanted to make 5 very broad contextual points. And the first is that we live in this amazing period of mobility, of money, of ideas, and of people, even though for the last 2 years, it's been characterized by a kind of lockdown life that we've all been living. But, you know, globally now, more than 750 million people have moved within their own countries. More than 280 million people have moved outside of their countries. And I'm guessing a lot of people on this call are migrants themselves and not living in the country in which they were born. So we live in this huge era of mobility and also this amazing era of population change. I was born in 1974, and the global population has doubled in my lifetime. And that's just, it's unprecedented in terms of the change in population that we have. So, you know, there's a massive mobility of people, and people are moving for all sorts of reasons. And migration is a massive and important driver of development, sharing ideas, building connections, building peace. But then also, you know, what gets a lot of the attention is where it's seen as a sort of negative force. At the end of last year, more than 90 million people were displaced from their homes by war, violence, disasters, or persecution, and that's more than doubled in the last dozen years, up from 40 million people a dozen years ago. So what we're seeing, and this is my second point, is that environmental natural resource trends are increasingly becoming a factor in that mobility. And we all know the arguments around climate change, but you know, we're looking at a greater temperature increase in the next 50 years than we've seen in the last 6,000 years, and a move from, say, 1% of the world's land area becoming, you know, too hot to live now to potentially, I think it's 19% of the world of the Earth's territory by 2070 could be dangerously a barely livable hot zone. So we have, you know, massive changes in terms of the environment that are changing where rain falls, where food can grow, where people can live, and at the same time, the way that we are managing the world is also changing where people can live. Over the last 20 years, something like 300 million people have been displaced by infrastructure projects, dams, roads, railways, and so on. And there are 3,500 dam projects at the moment, major dam projects under construction or planned. So, you know, there's the combination of climate change, environmental change, and the ways that we're managing our planet are becoming a factor in where people can live. And this is my third point, that when we start talking about the numbers that are involved, those numbers are paralyzingly huge. There's figures from up to 1.2 billion people might be forced to move from their homes as a result of climate change by the middle of the century. That's a high estimate, but the one that's most commonly talked about is 200 million people. And that's a huge number. It's difficult to put in context, but that could be 1 in 45 people alive by 2050 would have been moved away from their house or their home as a result of climate change. So a very significant impact on who can live where. And I guess my fourth point is that migration has been instrumentalized in the climate debate often as one of the reasons why we have to do something about climate change. And that's, in a sense, it's absolutely right, because, you know, migration, when it's forced, is bad for those people themselves and can be difficult to manage for the communities in which they live. But also we have to remember that migration is, as I was saying at the beginning, a very important way of bringing people together, sharing ideas, building connections. And the fifth point is that we tend to focus on the push reasons for forced migration and perhaps ignore some of the pull reasons why different people migrate to particular places. And so I guess this is the segue into Salim's presentation. This is part of the rationale for why the International Resource Panel wanted to take a very neutral, balanced view at the links between environmental change, natural resources, and human mobility as a way of depoliticizing it, understanding it, and sort of seeing where it could go in future. So back to you.
Thanks, Ollie. That's a great start. From here, let's go over to Salim.
Okay, greetings everyone. Thank you so much, AJ, for that introduction, and great to partner with IOM on this session. So I'm going to breeze through some of the findings of this upcoming report from the International Resource Panel. Those of you who are not familiar with the panel, we are a group of around 40 experts from around the world who work on a range of issues, both natural scientists and social scientists, dealing with resource security. And we're a panel similar to the IPCC or other UN mandated panels. But what's different is that we do not have to confine our work to one treaty. We can work across many different environmental diplomatic efforts. And so that gives us certain level of leverage in the topics which are covered. And we're under the UN Environment Program auspices and with a small secretariat in Paris. So I'm just going to go through this report's key findings. The report itself is quite large and involved experts from all over the world as well. I'll just note some of the key participants. I was the coordinating lead author, but the real substantive expertise in the panel on migration is with Dominique Knifton from University of Sussex, and several other scholars, including Ollie, who contributed to the report as well. So we wanted to make sure that the report was relevant to policymakers, and all IRP reports also have a summary for policymakers. So when it's published in about 3 to 4 months, you'll see there will be a separate document, a summary for policymakers, which will be translated into all the UN languages, and then there'll be the larger report as well. So essentially, we're talking about policy options around the resource mobility nexus. We wanted to focus on resources, natural resources, of course, given the context of the environment, and see what are the different kinds of policy options there. There are sort of these preventative policies around addressing resource degradation at points of origin of migration. There are policy options also around this notion of trapped locations where people need to move, but they cannot move because of resource constraints. There are adaptation aspects of policies in terms of what can be done when you have this migration process unfolding. And then there are policies that support integration of migrants into sustainable management of resources. So we looked at all of those aspects as well. So 10 key messages of the report. The first message that I think is quite provocative in the context of this audience to some degree is that natural resources, they mediate the impact between global environmental change and human mobility, but the relationship is not linear. And this is important because a lot of the academic discourse in environmental security and peace building has been trying to establish some kind of causality in terms of, some of the papers people may have read about the Syrian conflict and migration caused by that being linked to climate change or resource access issues. And what we find in terms of reviewing the literature, the data that's available, that is not a very convincing argument. That in fact, the relationship is bidirectional, and it's a complex systems approach that we use. So it's an issue that needs to be looked at with nuance. Perhaps the only exception to that is sea level rise, and that's not directly a resource issue. So we didn't go into that because the World Bank did a groundswell report, some of you may be familiar with, which looked at sea level rise and migration. And that's probably the only area where you can make a direct linear causality, but that's not the focus of our report because we're focusing on the resource dimension more directly. Secondly, as Ollie was alluding to, hydropower infrastructure presents the most direct example of resource development linkages to involuntary migration. And of course, this has been well studied for many decades. We had the World Commission on Dams about 20 years ago, which did a landmark report on this. And we did some estimates, and it's, especially with the 200 recent hydropower development projects, between 2000 and 2018, they've displaced between 900,000 and 2 million people already. And we did a geospatial analysis of this also. So in the report, there are lots of maps which look at the geospatial dimension of this. Thirdly, refugee camp establishment is characterized by rapid land use change. So we did look at some specific examples like the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. However, activities by camp inhabitants often constitute productive land use around within the camp where access and use are permitted. So this is also something like we don't want to blame the migrants. You know, they have been, especially these are people who have been forced out, and the refugees who are in this very dire strait. But it's another argument to use to make sure that we provide appropriate resources and locate these refugee camps in areas where there is resource access. Fourthly, resource rushes are often accompanied by relatively discrete inward mobility. And this is a really, I think, surprising finding of our report, is that actually, you know, mineral resources especially, and we looked at artisanal mining and those kinds of resource rushes, they actually lead to a lot of inward mobility to the extent that they reduce international migration. You know, so a lot of the policy drivers around resource security and international migration, especially coming from Africa to Europe, what we find is that in places where there have been resource rushes, in places like Madagascar, for example, where there was a major sapphire rush, they actually reduced the opportunities and incentives for international migration, which makes sense to some degree, but it was something that people had not adverted to. And we had an econometric analysis that was done by colleagues at University of Vienna and IASA, and that's being also published separately as a peer-reviewed paper. But that was one of the key sort of analytical findings of the report that's based on primary analysis. Fifth, we looked at impacts of droughts on
6 minutes, so if you could try to wrap
Okay,
up,
yeah,
please.
sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Yeah, we looked at impact of droughts on migration, and this is highly dependent on local income. So this is also something that makes sense to some degree. You know, what happens accordingly. Reductions in soil carbon was also another variable we looked at, and it's not significantly related to mobility flows. So this was another important finding that way. Making systems maps, we found, was a very good policy tool. We have a whole chapter which looks at systems mapping to look at the nexus between especially gender issues. Policies around, eighth is policies around resource mobility should be aligned along these adaptive resilience frameworks. And that's something which we can talk about in the discussion. And the last two, land ownership and tenure, are important mitigating forces around migration. And we looked at data, especially from East Africa on that. And then finally, remittances of migrants have a lot of potential on the policy side, which can be leveraged for natural resource restoration efforts. And remittance green bonds was an important policy tool which we looked at. Thank you, AJ.
Perfect. Thank you, Salim.
A minute or so.
We'll allow it. Thank you. Now over to Richard.
Thank you. So I'm also going to be presenting a report, and the resource that's the focus of this report is sort of biodiversity, largely conceived. It's an IUCN report that is called Planet on the Move, the Role of Conservation at the Intersection of Migration, Conflict, and Environmental Change. It's scheduled to be launched on Earth Day this year. The lead authors are myself, Elaine Chao, and Philippe Le Bihan, and Galio Saints, but there's about 25 contributing authors. Many of them are part of this conference. And there's a companion article that comes out this month. And this builds on IUCN's sort of long interest in the relationship between conservation practice on the one hand, environmental change, and conflict and peace. And very explicitly on a 2002 report, Conserving the Peace, done between IUCN and ISD, and a bunch of other reports, the CIWWF report, Species on the Move, or People on the Move, I mean, and a host of reports that I'm sure you're familiar with that have come out recently. And it's really, the IUCN report is a response to several factors. One is the sort of alarming securitization of environmental displacement that we saw accelerate after the publication of the fifth assessment report in 2014. So the instinct of much of the policy community was to see this as a problem, as a threat, a security threat, a burden, something that had to be redirected. The difficulty that we have seen in the past few years, the world has had when it faces surges of displaced people, whether they're from Syria or Myanmar or Central America, we're seeing a world that is not coping with even small numbers of people very well. Projections, and Ollie mentioned this, suggesting that as many as 1.2 billion people are currently vulnerable to environmental displacement, and that as much as 30% of humankind may by the end of the century be living in conditions that are really too hot and humid for the human body to survive in and flourish in. But in addition to that, and something we bring in is evidence that at least 50% of non-human species and potentially all non-human species are moving in response to climate impacts today. So it isn't just humans that are being displaced, it is an entire planet that is on the move in an accelerated fashion in novel scales due to climate impacts and other variables. Climate obviously is not the only thing that factors in a decision to move, but it is an important thing. It weighs in heavily. And there's a sense, finally, that all of this matters greatly to the conservation community. The conservation community might be well positioned to help frame the issue and find creative, fair solutions that integrate, protection of biodiversity and human rights, human concerns, but it is also positioned to make things more difficult by trying, for example, to expand protected areas by pushing people out, by displacing people itself. So the purpose of the report is really to stimulate discussion in the conservation community and between the conservation community and experts in migration, humanitarian affairs, and development around how do we deal with this issue together? How do we deal with a challenge that the scale of which is unprecedented in human experience, potentially unprecedented? And we want to, in the report sort of underscores the extent to which movement is a completely natural response, to different forms of stress and shock. So the framing of movement of humans and other species as invasive or as a security problem is sort of at odds with natural history and runs the risk of mobilizing the wrong set of tools to address this particular problem. So the report answers 4 questions. How might an acceleration of migration of all types of human and non-human species affect current conservation practices? What are the laws, policies, and other tools we have to manage this? Do we need to reimagine conservation at this time? And if so, what might this reimagining entail? And we suggest, and we have several recommendations. One is deepening the already present, but deepening, it's not pervasive across the conservation community, concern about reconciling biodiversity needs, ecosystem needs with human rights. The second is deepening the focus on that most of the 1.2 billion people who are vulnerable to displacement by climate effects are also the people vulnerable to displacement in terms of the sort of Earth needs half, the 30 by 30 idea and the 50 by 50 idea, traditional communities, indigenous peoples, and so on. We underscore the importance of thinking about trapped species and trapped communities that are facing enormous stress, but for some reason are not able to move. And working towards reconsidering ideas that have floated up in the conservation community historically, but have often not gone very far, like the idea of working landscapes or territories of life, of mobile protected areas, of connectivity conservation and ex situ conservation. And the concern, of course, that the report ends up is if we don't do this, if the conservation community does not join development people and security people and migration people and peace building people to be part of this conversation, it may actually be a driver of some of the negative outcomes that people concern. It may, contribute to greater levels of conflict and suffering in the world when it potentially has a role to play in helping, manage these things in ways that make sense ecologically and are fair to humans, and acknowledge that humans alone are not moving. So I know I will have and the report is very long and has lots of detail. So I hope that over the next couple of months, some of you will have an opportunity to take a look at it. But I'll stop there. I think that's 6 minutes.
Perfect. Great timing. Thank you, Richard. Now over to Molly. Let's hear from you.
Great. Just going to share my screen here. Now it's my challenge to pack everything I can into 6 minutes. So thanks so much for the introduction and of course for the invitation to join the discussion today. So I'm going to actually shift the conversation to talk a little bit about programming solutions for addressing linkages between climate change, environment, and peace building challenges that are impacting mobility and migration in very different ways. And so to do this, I'll share a couple of examples from UNEP's climate security projects in Western Nepal and in North Darfur, Sudan. I should have mentioned that I work on UNEP's climate security portfolio. So we have 2 pilot projects, one in each of these places. And I'm going to jump right in because I know that time is short. Okay, so Nepal and Sudan are 2 very different climate conflict and mobility contexts. Nepal is very much a post-conflict context, and our project there is located in the western part of the country in the Karnali River Basin, which is experiencing more frequent and extreme weather events and flooding as a result of climate change, which is undermining the livelihoods of farmers in the region. This is also an area where seasonal migration, both across the border to India, but also within Nepal to larger cities, has long been practiced to supplement income of farmers, particularly among young men. But so migration in this area is not new. But what we have learned is that more people are migrating and migrating for longer periods of time. So this has particular implications both on the people who migrate, but as was already explained in earlier in the earlier presentations, as well for those who remain behind, which in the project communities tend to be women. And then we have North Darfur, Sudan, which is home to both pastoralists and farmers. And this is an area where migration is very much woven into the fabric of society, particularly for nomadic pastoralists who have traditionally relied or practiced transhumance to cope with seasonal changes or changes to the climate. But now this is changing because scarcity of key natural resources, so water, fertile land, have led pastoralists to change or alter their migratory patterns, and has also impacted the way farmers use their land, at times expanding, for example, into migratory routes. And this results in tensions, which tend to emerge between farmers and herders along migratory routes. So this is an extremely simplistic description of each of these contexts, and probably a context that many of you are very familiar with in the context of climate security and migration. But from a programming perspective, we found that when these issues and these challenges are integrated from the start, climate change adaptation and natural resource management interventions can help to create the conditions so that people are not forced to move, or to enable sort of peaceful movement of those for which migration or mobility is an integral part of their lives or an important adaptation strategy. So I won't go too much into the details, but just to say this involves kind of 3 core components. And the first is conducting an integrated climate security analysis before designing a project, so that programming and projects well understand the context, both in terms of climate, mobility, peace and security, et cetera, in which they're operating. The second is delivering a mix of more traditional climate change adaptation activities, as well as peace building activities that are complementary. And then the third is measuring results both for climate change adaptation, as well as for peace building. So I'm going to very, very briefly share two examples of our results from our programming in Nepal and Sudan, just to give you a flavor of what this looks like in reality. And in Nepal, we found that supporting climate resilient livelihood opportunities can enhance the economic well-being of affected populations and are often necessary, as we well know, to create the conditions so that people who do not want to migrate do not have to migrate. So on the screen, you see a photo of Gita, and this is a woman whose family lost their livelihoods as a result of flooding in Nepal. And Gita's husband migrated away in search of alternative livelihood sources, or alternative sources of income. And through the project, Gita received support to develop sort of off-farm sources of livelihood. So she created actually a small restaurant, which enabled her husband to return home and to actually work in this business as well. So to manage these impacts of climate change. And then moving to Sudan, the project here specifically sought to prevent or mitigate conflicts that tend to erupt along migratory routes. And there were several processes that contributed to this. So at the beginning of the project, at the very beginning, the project helped to kind of support or establish committees, local natural resource management committees made up of both pastoralists and farmers to manage shared resources and to mediate or resolve disputes. It also then worked with these committees to support a process to expand and demarcate migratory routes, and in particular, marking potential hotspots together. So areas that are, more prone to conflict, as well as areas that are can have sort of more open grazing. And then finally, the projects provided some of the key infrastructure that was identified by the communities as necessary to enhance the access to resources. So things like water points along migratory routes. And we found that—
It's time, Molly.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. That together these activities contributed not only to mitigating conflict, but also kind of to building trust and enhancing relationships between different groups. So for example, farmers and pastoralists was described coming together for social events, drinking tea together at markets, etc., which was a real shift from the previous context. So I'll stop there and happy to kind of discuss key takeaways or lessons in the discussion.
Thanks, Molly. We're going to send it over to my colleague, Dave, now. David, over to you.
Hi, AJ. Hi, all. So yeah, time is of the essence, so I'll start immediately. So I wanted to open really by reflecting from my side on the diverse range of mobility, and I think in some cases immobility, experienced in the context of climate change and environmental degradation that we're talking about. For me, this starting point is actually very important. It highlights both the complexity and the opportunities available to generate coherent policy and operational responses across the humanitarian, development, and peacebuilding nexus. So the different types of mobility that occur, sometimes concurrently in these contexts, for us makes it difficult to neatly classify movements into clear categories. When we investigate the climate conflict mobility link, it's important to acknowledge that any solution to the challenges presented needs to look at the spectrum of human mobility as a whole. Only a truly holistic approach that factors in the complex and intersecting dynamics at play and the mixed migration realities will engender an impactful and comprehensive response. Now, with this in mind, a part of the struggle experienced, I think, in the humanitarian or by humanitarian peacebuilding and development actors can be this very complexity. In many contexts, the convergence between intersecting threats and dynamics overwhelms available coordination systems and technical capacities at the country and the regional level. In terms of operationalizing responses, it raises a serious question. How can we be both impactful and targeted and leverage the unique and often interlinked capacities of the constellation of actors at play? And how can we create approaches that can be scaled across such a diverse range of environments? So addressing this requires actors on the ground to develop a common understanding of the relationship between climate change and environmental degradation and mobility. At its core, this requires efforts to strengthen the evidence base of the relationship through the production, analysis, and dissemination of relevant data and the development of interoperable data sets and sharing systems. It also necessitates increased coordination amongst partners to generate this common understanding, policy coherency, and joint approaches, and stronger monitoring and evaluation of initiatives. Not only will this feed into the design of effective prevention and preparedness measures, but it will also support informed, evidence-based responses when climate-induced displacement and other forms of mobility occur. So building upon this holistic understanding of climate and security complexity, we must also invest in the complementarity of humanitarian action, peace building, sustainable development, climate change adaptation, and the disaster risk reduction sectors, and better integrate mobility dimensions across these areas. So this necessitates, for me, stronger coordination and planning mechanisms to strengthen operational coalitions between peace building, disaster risk reduction, and climate actors where fragmentations continue. In terms of coordination and partnerships, there are good initiatives already underway that encourage collaboration, like the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Frameworks and multi-partner joint programs. However, for me, significant gaps remain. An example of this is that most organizations that implement emergency and development programming assimilate do no harm approaches into their institutional principles, but there remains no policy framework for DRR and climate change practitioners that work in conflict and fragility with limited evidence of engagement between these practitioners and the peacebuilding community. Focusing on the disaster risk, for example, a review of more than 50 vulnerability and capacity assessments and disaster risk reduction frameworks across international NGOs, the UN, and multilateral institutions showed no systematic documentation of conflict and fragility in a way that would enable inter-program learning or improve practices across different contexts. This leads to the underutilization of do no harm approaches and impedes the integration of conflict sensitivity into DRR and climate action. Now, beyond this, and in line with the theme, I want to focus a bit on the peace building pillar, specifically the importance of continuing to design comprehensive responses that build upon and integrate into existing peace building mechanisms. Doing this necessitates enhanced monitoring and evaluation and learning from peace building initiatives and stronger efforts to ensure this learning is shared with relevant stakeholders. This type of learning could support the integration of conflict dynamics into the construction of disaster risk, for example, or hazard profiles and responses to climate change. It would also encourage the mainstreaming of conflict sensitivity and conflict analysis into risk analysis and climate change policies and vice versa. This requires the development of clearer guidance, tools, definitions, and approaches specific to programming responses in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. There are multiple operational examples of climate change adaptation implemented in fragile and conflict settings. However, these solutions remain poorly documented. The community should work to harness this operational learning to deepen the understanding of approaches, good practices, and lessons learned. And finally, I think we should ensure there is a conducive environment, opportunities, and resources to stabilize climate fragile locations and vulnerable communities through supportive policy architecture. There is no single entry point, and this requires reflection on broader peacekeeping and climate change mandates and the identification of appropriate policy and programmatic hooks to increase coherency. Talking more to this point, we see that scaling approaches in learning can be impeded by limited policy coherency across regional organizations and bodies. For example, when we hone in on the Africa continent, IOM work supports both regional economic communities and member states to address climate-induced displacement and migration. Some RECs have very advanced policies on cross-border migration in the context of disaster and climate change, whilst others have yet to implement policies or put policies in place. Many of the member states in Africa are members of more than one community, generating low policy coherence and sometimes confusion. Even in the context when there's free movement agreements, there's often nothing specifically focused on movement in the context of slow and sudden onset hazards and climate change, and implementation of practices has been largely inconsistent. Compounding this, we see that member states themselves may not have domestic policies on climate change and its impact on mobility, limiting the basis on which to implement and integrate regional policies at the national level. Those that do have these policies. Okay, sure. I'll close then just by, I think, noting that as policies and programming sort of increases the integration of human mobility into climate security, we must really reflect on its place and the language used. We often see securitized approaches that describe human mobility as a risk more than an opportunity. However, managed, orderly, and well-planned mobility, responses, and preparedness efforts really can significantly contribute to development, resilience, and adaptation. Thank you.
Thanks for that, David. And I took note of the gaps so that we can work on that. So I'm coming for you afterwards. And then last but not least, let's go to Shayna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of today's session. And today I'm just going to talk briefly about migration as an adaptation strategy to climate change and how the Migration with Dignity framework that I've been working on in partnership with the Environmental Law Institute, the International Organization for Migration, the Ocean Policy Research Institute, and Dignity Rights International seeks to improve the experiences of migrants by offering policy options that provide reciprocal benefits to both the individuals that are migrating and to the governments that are receiving them. It also can serve as a conflict prevention tool in climate and other similar conditions. So we know, as many people have already covered today, that a confluence of dynamic factors, environmental change, climate change, altered resource distribution and access, livelihood impacts, among many others, all increase the likelihood of migration. And national adaptation strategies are often failing to account for large-scale migration, domestically or otherwise. And this can often generate tensions that eventually lead to or escalate conflict if not well managed. So an example of this would be looking at climate-related and environmental-related factors in the Lake Chad Basin, where the size of the lake and the resources from the lake have become depleted over time, thus disrupting livelihoods, incomes, food supplies, and exacerbating income inequalities, particularly among youth, which has made it easier for extremist organizations like Boko Haram and others to recruit young soldiers and perpetuate violence in vulnerable communities. The number of challenges faced by migrants as they move can be overwhelming. Discrimination, violence, lack of adequate healthcare and legal services, forced labor, detention, limited access to information, resources, assistance. All of these leave human rights and human dignity as an afterthought in many cases. And while international instruments such as the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration reframe some of the harmful narratives on migration, we still need to have greater attention paid to developing more human-centered and adaptive approaches that work across the cycle of migration. Because as has been stated by others in this panel, migration is not unidirectional. It can be irregular, it's dynamic, and we need to be able to essentially create human rights and dignity rights perspectives in relation to this dynamism that's occurring across the migration cycle. So in consideration of this, my colleagues and I have developed a legal and policy framework for migration with dignity. The framework intends to reduce human suffering and promote human dignity, and can be used as a conflict prevention tool, particularly in the context of climate-related migration, but also in consideration of other environmental change as well. It reflects fundamental aspects of the migration experience that are central to supporting human rights and dignity rights across the cycle of migration, but it also includes aspects that are called into question during periods of conflict, including freedom of movement, security, equality, civil rights, and access to services, as well as a basic quality of life. And so this can include whether there are opportunities for formal employment, for education, for access to healthcare or legal services when needed, but also whether or not individuals have a roof over their head or the ability to provide for their families. And relevant application of the framework includes perspectives on gender and social inclusion, disability, and many other contexts. But the intent is really to capture the human experience during migration and offer a sort of implementation guide, if you will, to the Global Compact or other similar instruments through our Migration with Dignity framework. So instead of suggesting that policies be more human-centered, we take the next step to provide more specific human-centered policy options that can be implemented and be more inclusive. And because of this, the framework is relevant across geographies, scales, reasons for migration, and legal systems, and can help countries and organizations that are looking for an alternative model to addressing migration patterns. So the Global Compact and other related agreements can be strengthened by human-centered approaches to migration, such as ours. There are a lot of other activities out there that do similar, have similar approaches, but there's still a need for improved opportunities to address migration in all its various forms and contexts, and to better consider what policies are working or where gaps exist in order to develop more accommodating solutions and ensure that people are able to migrate with dignity. We are working to address many of these components in our Migration with Dignity framework, and I'm happy to share more of this with all of you in attendance if you're interested in learning more. And with that, I'll end there. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Shana. That was perfect. So from now, we're going to go into questions and answers. We have about 30 minutes dedicated to this, and I love that I'm seeing some questions already starting to come into the chat box. So we're going to go through some of those questions. If you prefer to just raise your hand, you can go ahead and do that, and we will get to you to ask your question directly. But the first question that we got was from Carl, and a lot of these questions I see are directed to specific people, but I actually think multiple panel members can provide different contexts and understandings on that. So I'm going to invite others to join in as well. So Carl was talking about, Molly, you were talking about projects in Nepal and Sudan, talking about impact, and I think his question relates to long-term impact. Are there plans to assess long-term impact? Are these benefits sustained 5 years, 10 years later? This challenge is shared by most resilience building efforts, and I was wondering if you could speak to this issue. So Molly, we can start with you, but then also David, I'm sure you're going to want to jump in on this as well. So over to you, Molly. Thank
you. I mean, this is a challenge that speaks true to, I think, many of us working on these issues. So the actual plans to, from UNEP's perspective, to go back and kind of monitor what stayed 5 years beyond a project or 10 years beyond a project vary quite specifically from project to project. But what I will say is that one of the core strategies of these two projects in particular, which seems to work well, again, these actually just ended there in earlier this year, has been to work directly with local government and local structures that exist in the communities. So with the hopes that after the project leaves, local government and these local structures, remember I talked about the committees, for example, that were set up and supported through each of the communities, and each of the communities will be able to kind of carry on these activities and sustain these activities beyond the end of the project life cycle. But I fully agree. I mean, in the case of Sudan, UNEP is fortunate that we have other kind of longer term projects that we are able to monitor, and will be able to continue to monitor kind of what the impacts are, and actually fold some of our project results with some of these structures and whatnot that were established through the project into kind of other projects that will take that on in the years to come. But this is very dependent on, you know, where our presence is and what in the years following the project. So I hope that starts to answer some of the questions. It's absolutely a challenge, but I think there are kind of key good practices and lessons learned that can be integrated into the design and delivery of a project that help to sustain some of those results.
Sure, that's a great start. And I don't know, any other panelists want to jump in to complement that?
Hey, AJ, I'll jump in. It's David.
Sure.
So just, very briefly, I think Molly touched upon something that we've experienced quite a lot of, I think, in terms of comprehensive financing to do these kind of assessments. I think that often, particularly in humanitarian settings, the humanitarian responses tend to outweigh or overshadow the development and longer term resilience building measures that are implemented sometimes, and this can impede activities like monitoring, effective monitoring and evaluation of some of the programming that we do. And it's only really, I think, for increasing the call for that kind of comprehensive financing from donors and member states towards this kind of activity that we're going to see opportunities for this kind of learning as we move forward, and for feeding into the broader UN country team and other at play as things are moving. I also think that that one other area where there's a potential low-hanging fruit is the potential to do joint assessments and joint planning, essentially across whether it be the UN system or a constellation of different actors working in the climate change adaptation and response space. It's really that we don't see those joint sort of monitoring activities occurring, whether they be geographically confined to actors operating in a particular area, whether they be thematically confined. It's often that each agency operates in silo, does its assessments, and then we lose the opportunity for that longer term assessment as it moves forward in evaluation. Over.
Thanks, David. Any other panelists want to jump in on this one? Okay, next, we've got a couple questions that somewhat relate to each other, so I'm going to try to group them a little bit. Alessandra was on fire and sent off a couple in one go. I liked the question about building on all these considerations on the framing of migration and climate change. How can the urgent dialogue around climate security be framed in a way that is not prone to be instrumentalized by closed border politics? And along the same line, I think there was a question towards the end by Daniel about policy interventions and how we can best consider policy interventions within the scope of communities receiving migrating populations, the work that's being done with these populations as well. So we can try to work those two together. Would somebody on the panel like to start? Shane, I was thinking
I can start.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead,
Shane. No, it's okay.
I was going to go with the policy question, and I'll just quickly share. Actually, we had a table that we had prepared in the report that I'll just quick. So these are the preventative policies that could be considered at the points of origin. So for example, you have policies to discourage, land conversion. And I mean, some of these are old policies. I mean, like, one of the biggest resource-linked migration episodes in human history was the American Dust Bowl, So there is plenty of policies from the US Department of Agriculture and the Soil Conservation Service and its follow-up efforts which were done that had some impact. They made mistakes, but there was some good policy learning. So that's one example. We have resource inventories that could be done. There are certain restoration efforts, water markets, these are key ones there. There was another question also around remittances, and just to give you an example of some of the remittance policies. There's a policy, for example, in Pakistan with reference to money invested by migrants. When they send money home, the government matches the funds if they can be invested in certain resource development projects in their villages. Because you have situations where entire villages, the men are working in the Gulf, in the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, and then they're sending back the remittances, and then the village redevelopment can be done in a way which is more sustainable. Philippines has set up a green remittance bond mechanism similarly. So there are some very specific policies around remittances which can be very impactful with migrants, especially in these countries. Insurance policies that have certain implications in this regard with reference to risk, and this is more with adaptation to resources and their microcredit schemes accordingly. So we did look at those level of very specific policies. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Salim. That's a great start. Shayna, you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you, AJ. So some of the things that we've seen or that we've also offered, I think, as part of the framework that we're developing is connected to making sure that as people move that they have access to different elements that we need, right, to really have like I think a robust life. And some of these are really simple, but I think they're taken for granted, such as making sure that there are employment opportunities, ways for people to contribute to the place where they are living, even if it's not where they will always be. Also access to education. There tends to be a lot of gaps along, whether people are moving, to one specific destination or where they're forced into like displacement or refugee context, like where migration just isn't offered as education isn't offered as an opportunity, not just for children, but also for adults who are looking to have more than a standard job. And so because what it ends up doing over time is removing any opportunities for upward mobility and contribution successfully to the society with which they're hoping to integrate. And then finally, issues related to translation are often commonly a problem. So just making sure that you're not expecting everyone to adapt to the language that is the national language of the country, but offers opportunities for people to understand how to fill out job employment paperwork or paperwork that allows them to get into schools, or has interpretation services available. A lot of these, I think, like smaller but easy fixes are considerations that should be integrated.
Thanks, Shayna. Does anybody else on the panel want to jump in on this one? Yeah, Richard, please go ahead.
So from our perspective, there's sort of two sides of the equation. One is we don't have very good information about how people make decisions to move under different circumstances. We know that there's some suggestions that people are not attracted as much to cities that are market cities versus cities that might have manufacturing and industry. So the labor market seems important and housing seems important. But the quality of information that people have and whether it's the right sort of information, because lots of people make a decision and then they discover that they're stuck in a peri-urban space around a city with very little access to the labor market or to housing. In fact, in parts of Africa, peri-urban space is growing at 5% a year, which is really sort of off the charts. And this is an area that's low on governance, low on amenities, and so on. So there's a big question about what information do people need to make the right decisions. On the other side of the equation, there are some cities or some areas that people move into that are highly vulnerable to climate effects themselves. They're already facing enormous challenges. They're not able to accommodate a surge of people. There are other places that maybe could, but they're not prepared to do that. And then there are still other places that probably could accommodate more people. And we don't have a good sense of how to match those areas where people might be accommodated and the information people are getting about where they can move to very well. So I think that the World Bank's Nomad project, for example, is trying to take steps to start to fill this gap with much more contextual local knowledge on both sides, the people who are deciding to move and the places where they may be deciding to move into. Because right now we are looking at this problem from a fairly high level of abstraction. And so we're not getting the more nuanced understandings. And as people have pointed out repeatedly, it's a complex world. People move for a whole lot of different reasons in fits and starts. Sometimes, if it's a big fire, they all move, but sometimes they sort of, move in incrementally or move halfway or move and return. So it's a complex world. And I think we need that finer resolution data to back up some of the policies that we will need to be able to manage this problem.
Thanks, Richard. Jill, I see you put your hand up. Was it related to this question or is it a new question?
It's both. So please, if you want to continue going on.
Sure. Okay. I just want to see if, yeah, sure. I just want to see if any other panelists would like to jump in on this question. No, we're good. Okay, Jill, if you had a comment on this one, very, very welcome to share it.
Hi, so yes, first off, thank you all for this great conversation. Really enjoying it, and I want to follow up with all of you with 1,000 questions. But I especially want to dive in a little bit to this question of like, what can we do? Because especially reflecting on something that Rob Jenkins said at a conference last week, that it's better to be 80% right at the right time than 100% right too late. And so I'm curious, like, what policies and practices can we start doing now according to different levels? Like at the local level, we have a lot of really, really good ideas that were already raised on this panel about what needs to happen interpersonally between migrants and receiving communities, and between pastoralists and herders, et cetera. We have a lot of really, really good ideas there. But then how do we start scaling that up to the, interstate, interprovince level, and then national level, and what kind of policies are needed internationally, like in transboundary water systems, et cetera. And do you think can support peaceful and voluntary migration that leads to good climate change adaptation in the long term, and is good for the migrants along the way? So yeah, that's my question is about both the scales, but then I'm also, because I'm biased, and just really see the water sector as a key piece to all of this. I'm really curious to start applying some of these policies specifically within that already interconnected sector. So thank you.
That's a juicy one. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, who wants to start us off there? Yeah, Ollie, jump in.
It's a huge question, and I certainly do not have a particularly comprehensive answer for it. For me, when I think about this, I look at the Global Compact on migration and the title of the Global Compact, which has all sorts of great ideas in it. It's a Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration, and it's built around achieving exactly that. And I think this kind of touches, I guess, on all of the things we're talking about in terms of safety for the migrants themselves. Orderliness in terms of understanding what's happening, planning for it, avoiding these kind of, this complete rush of people in unpredictable ways, and regular in a sense of that it's documented, managed, and within systems of governance. So for me, that Global Compact has within it a lot of the answers. And as you know, I'm sure better than me, the best laid plans become highly difficult to put into practice, particularly as when we saw a whole set of countries refused at the last moment to sign up to the Global Compact because it was very politically sensitive, which comes back, I guess, to this framing of migrants as a bad thing under climate change. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and put more nuance into that, to sort of show the positives as well as the risks around that, to achieve that safe, orderly, and regular migration. And just to give one example of something that I've been looking into that I think is interesting around ways to deal with this from a humanitarian perspective, because I think this is the starting point for this as well, is when you have large-scale refugee movements. The default is always to focus on the refugees, and again, this is very obvious, but we tend to build programs around those refugees and forget the local communities in which they're arriving, which inherently builds up tensions and feelings of special treatment, even if not warranted. So, UNDP and UNHCR and many other organizations are managing the Syrian Refugee Response and Resilience Program, which is specifically around providing services both to refugees, and Syria is the largest source of refugees at the moment, but also the communities in which they're going. And I think that kind of double view of refugees and host communities, or forced migrants and destination communities, I think is absolutely critical. Back to you.
Thanks, Ollie. Let's hear from some other panel members. Anybody else, something to add?
Well, just quickly, I'd say that one of the key lessons is the domestic migration versus international migration. We have to be very cautious about not conflating the policies. It's very attractive for politicians to drum up and use climate change as a mechanism to draw attention now for concerns around international migration. The data is not very convincing. I mean, like in Central America, we have a panel later today, in fact, on migration nexus there. Most of the resource-linked migration in Central America is domestic. The international migration is economically linked. And let us not try to force the resource environment issue on economic migration, which is not even linked to resources. It's simple inequality, basic income issues. Do not try to link everything to the farmer can't get the food on the table because the crops are dry because of climate change, when the data is just not there. So I think that for me, in terms of a big picture upscaling of policy, do not be opportunistic, dear environmental researchers, when it comes to making these conflations. There is a real issue at the domestic migration level with resource issues. It is not as much with the international migration.
Thanks, Salim. I want to stop us on this question because we have two from colleagues, peers who are working in the field, and I want to make sure we're addressing their kind of practical field concerns as well. So the first one is from a peer who's saying we're pre-testing a project that promotes access to information on climate variability to secure livelihood and resilience among young people. The biggest challenge seems to be the limited resources to advance the national framework that supports environmental peacebuilding in Uganda. We face major social obstacles promoted by regional politics and promoting migration. As agencies, this is a big opportunity to learn. Is there a resource toolkit? I mean, he mentions IOM, but any organization that we can benefit from to support capacity building for community awareness initiatives. What do you guys think? Anybody on the panel want to jump in? Molly, go ahead.
I will jump in just on terms of resources, kind of concretely a couple things to offer from the project that I described and from NEP's climate change and security, their broader work on climate change and security. We do have a couple of tools, in particular, some tools for conducting integrated analysis that we designed at the beginning of the project to actually guide our own kind of thinking and project design. And so they're in process of being updated, but I'm very happy to kind of share drafts of the tools or provide them to you. And there is also an online training, if it's useful, on climate change and security and how to kind of think about framing these issues. That's available. I can stick the link in the chat. But that's also, I think, some of these tools that help to kind of piece apart how to actually conduct integrated analysis that looks at the linkages between these different issues may be useful for your purposes.
Thanks for that, Molly. Anybody else on the panel want to jump in?
I will. I'll just say maybe from the NASA perspective, we've got a capacity building program that is jointly funded by both NASA and by USAID, and it is called Severe, which provides a lot of more of the visualizations for climate and like resources management that then connect to livelihoods. And so in the case of Uganda, we've got a hub called through our CMRD based in Kenya that provides a lot of capacity building, for better understanding how to use the Earth observations and other visualizations that can provide more science-based support to different policy options. But there are a number of hubs, and so if we're looking in different contexts, they exist in parts of Asia, in Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa, and then also in Central America and in South America. So I can provide more information on that if there's additional interest.
Thanks, Shana. And David's jumping in. Over to you, Jane.
Hey, AJ. Yeah, coming over. So from the IOM side, there are a number of different capacity building tools, and also I think framing tools that we can use as we move forward. Specifically, IOM did just release its institutional migration, environment, and climate change strategy this year, I think, which goes on. It will be, I think it's a 10-year strategy that outlines the key areas that we'll be focusing on, and it also talks to the framing of the issue in terms of IOM's institutional approach. And I think that can be really useful when you're working with hesitant or resistant counterparts, whether they be government counterparts or non-government stakeholders, in terms of understanding and utilizing language that's in line with seeing migration as a key strategy and adaptation tool and a strategy to respond to to climate change and environmental degradation dynamics. Separately, IOM has launched a series of capacity building trainings targeting mid to senior level policymakers and practitioners active in the environmental and migration areas. So really these trainings, I suppose, aim to provide people with a basic understanding of migration, environment and climate change concepts and terminology, and provide concrete tools that can support national sort of and regional policymakers as we move forward. And I think separately to mention that we have an upcoming strategy being released on climate conflict that's an integration of two different divisions or departments within IOM, the Migration, Environment and Climate Change and our Transition and Recovery division, that each bring to the table, I think, quite a lot of institutional capacity and knowledge around operating in fragile and conflict affected areas and responding to climate change and environmental degradation dynamics as things are moving forward. And then finally, I think one other point is that we do have the MICIC training system that we have rolled out, and we have a series of training of trainers, which is MICIC is the migration, the migrants in crisis affected context essentially, and it looks at providing governments and stakeholders with the tools and the capacity and the knowledge to understand mobility in the context of crisis and the various approaches to dealing with that issue. Over.
Thanks, David. I'm going to move to the last question, and I think this is a good one for us to be able to wrap up on. This is another one from the field. So regional and political communities do not frequently match with the environmental agroecological areas. How do we address climatic challenges and improve the population living conditions when there is no space for climate change in terms of regional policies? So the example given is the Lake Tanganyika Basin, where the authority has no real political leverage. So the question is, do we have any success stories from other regions that we can share, any lessons learned, anything best practices that might be useful? Who wants to jump in on that one?
So this is about, just for clarification, it's about resettlement of communities and finding location, and I will read through the exact, or are they talking about involuntary movements?
I don't want to speak for them, but I think the question is about how do we address the challenges that we're facing and how do we continue to improve life for the populations that are living in these places, when, especially in areas where political authorities don't have a lot of political leverage.
Yeah, I mean, so there is a growing literature on resettlement and planning for resettlement, and some of it is for like projects and resettling people, like for dams. But then there is also planning for involuntary, disaster-linked resettlement. And I think what's important is having good early warning systems in place so that even if the authorities are not very supportive, if you have some kind of a system in place, you can suggest when a crisis happens or when there is this kind of development opportunity, and then you move people there. So we've seen that, like with mining projects, having already pre-existing land which is potentially laid out, which will be arable, and people will be able to live there more comfortably, planned out.
Didn't unmute myself. I said, thanks, Salim. I'm going to come to you, Molly, but I think, again, the issue is more about when there isn't a space for a conversation about climate change. Like if we don't have space for regional policies, for national policies, maybe the government doesn't have that authority, doesn't have the political leverage. How can we continue to engage with populations? How can we work on improving challenges related to this climate conflict link to make sure that we can continue to improve lives and work on these things? Molly, over to you.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of quick points. First, in terms of language, sometimes it is not possible to talk about climate change, just as it is not possible to talk about conflict, et cetera, and different contexts have kind of different sensitivities to the issues. So one thing to think about, or kind of strategy or process to think about, is the way these issues are framed. So if it's not climate change, maybe it is something else. It is land use planning or livelihoods or development. If it's not conflict, in particular in Nepal, for example, we definitely did not talk about conflict or security challenges, because that was not appropriate for the context. The challenges there were much more around sort of intercommunal disputes, competition over resources, etc. So, I mean, I think these issues can be called different things in different contexts, but oftentimes the approach and the interventions that we use to address them look very similarly. The two other points, definitely on the regional dimension, it's true that that climate change does not see international borders or national borders, but working at the local, when there is not sort of that international framework to support larger planning processes or policy processes, sometimes working at the very local level can be a good entry point or alternative to kind of pragmatically get things done, but also really have impact on the affected populations. And then in terms of international response, we have also found that where there is, let's say, political deadlock, or where there are other challenges related to, countries talking across borders, thinking about environment or using sort of more technocratic approaches, environmental conversations can be an interesting entry point to actually bringing governments or communities together to the table that wouldn't otherwise be at the table. So, I mean, I think it's a lot about sort of how you frame the issues with kind of clear objectives and purpose in mind.
Thanks, Molly. And Richard, I think you had your hand up before and I didn't see you if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I think very quickly again, the top roughly 10% of the world is extremely mobile, and it moves around, it moves from urban to rural under the pressure of COVID, it moves its assets around, it educates its children, it has 1 or 2 passports. The top 10% is extremely mobile and moves under stress, moves under shock, moves driven by opportunity. But a lot of the world is very, very challenged in terms of mobility. And so the sort of things that we need to do, I think that concrete steps might include cities mobilizing and to coordinate behaviors like they have in various regions around climate change, really thinking carefully about the legal protection the world is prepared to afford environmentally displaced people. That's a big challenge. There's a lot of pushback to making any sort of commitment. Well, if the world's got to make some sort of commitment, because we have a large number of people who are in conditions of acute vulnerability. I think that clarity around relocation policies, what will they really entail? And capacity building, where having people leave will also leave a big gap behind. So what would it take for people to stay? We need to think about building capacity in those areas where people are starting to feel stress of climate change and other factors, and get a better understanding of what would be needed to induce them to remain and to adapt there. I think that there's a lot of capacity building, better information flows, legal protections, and we really need to sort of move some of those agendas forward, because the top of the world it has managed its own risk extremely well. And so largely it has insulated itself from most of the stress and shock that the world is going through right now. It's the bottom half of the world where the risk is not managed at all well, and where there's constant, crisis in the near future.
Thank you, Richard. David, I see you. We're running really short on time, so 1 minute or less, please. Thank you.
Sure, perfect. Okay. So yeah, I think we have seen the traditional arguments in fragile and conflict-affected settings towards the value of responses are often inadequate, and they don't seem to get much traction with actors. So from our side, we've seen community-based approaches to climate change adaptation, and particularly disaster risk reduction, specifically in these areas, have had a lot of traction. One that comes to mind specifically has been around diaspora engagement in Sudan, where we brought diaspora communities community members back to particular areas who had technical capacity in climate change adaptation, and we worked with the local communities to develop action plans. It was once the communities developed the action plans and this bottom-up approach that we actually saw there was a little bit more traction with local government counterparts in the states at the state level, and that then fed into national level dialogue at some point in time. But it was a slow bottom-up approach that we took that really had the biggest results that we saw.
Brilliant, thank you. So that was the end of our question and answer. We are going to do 1 minute for each of the panelists to sum up, hit us with your best parting words, and then we'll do a very, very quick summary of the main points that each of you did. So Ollie, over to you, 1 minute or less, please.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make one additional point, which I guess follows on from what everybody has been saying, is that, you know, if we look at the number of people displaced having increased, having doubled over the last 12 years, we're looking at it potentially doubling again over the next 20, 30 years. You know, we need to think about the humanitarian system and the development system to respond to these people's needs, whether forced as a result of slow onset disasters or quick onset disasters. It's a significant challenge for the humanitarian system to deal with, and you know, we haven't got the systems in place to manage, you know, something like 200 million people forcibly displaced as a result of climate change. So that's, I think, one of the things we need to think about as we move forward. Back to you.
Thanks, Ollie. Over to you, Salim. Hit us.
Yes, I mean, I think take-home message for this whole topic is that we should resist the temptation of linear causality. Just because something is complex does not mean it cannot be managed. A lot of our policymakers, you know, when I go to our steering committee, they're like, oh, it's too complex, then how are we going to solve it? Give us a simple solution. The reality is there are ways to deal with complex systems. You have integrated mechanisms. We have great ways of sharing data now. So we have the technologies, we have the human capital. That's why programs like Jeff are now starting much more integrated project delivery rather than just having siloed delivery. So I think we're in a point of transition, but migration has to be thought of in that sense. The second only quick take home is, please do not think of migration as a pathology. Migration and resource linkages are as old as humanity, and we need to work with them in that constructive sense. Yes, there are some aspects which are problematic, but do not think of the whole dynamic as a pathology just because politicians may push you in that direction.
Thank you, Salim. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to echo what other people said. One is that you know, migration is natural, and the entire planet is being moved around in ways that are somewhat novel, and we need to take stock of that. A lot of the movement is being framed as a security problem or a cost, and so on. I think that the one thing that I don't know the solution to, but one thing that seems to me to be really important is that at multiple levels, in governments, in large corporations, in universities, people have pivoted away in large measure from big problems, you know, deterred by exactly what Salim just said, you know, this idea that these big complicated problems are too hard to take on. And so we're seeing a lot of movement towards very small ambitions, very small sort of aspirations at a time when the world needs much more big thinking, and to recognize that we can solve big complex problems. You know, it's a question of how we choose to allocate our resources and what values we want, how we decide to set our priorities, but to be deterred from that. And I think that we're starting to see a trend at many scales of being deterred by what looks like a complex, uncertain world, making decisions under conditions of deep uncertainty, having to plan for multiple futures. People are shying away from that just at the time when they should be embracing that. So I think that, you know, we are putting ourselves on an alarming trajectory into the future.
Thank you, Richard. Molly, you're up.
Thank you. I will continue on the theme of managing complexity, but from a programmatic perspective, I would just urge that programs need to be designed in a way that is appropriate for the context, and that requires kind of grounding program design in really localized context-specific and integrated analysis, and including in your team sort of a diverse mix of expertise. So those with expertise in peace building, as well as those with expertise in environmental management or climate change adaptation, migration, et cetera. And then my third point, kind of piggybacking off of David's last point, is the importance of bottom-up approaches and really locally grounded approaches. So co-designing projects and programs with affected populations and local communities so that they are locally owned and results can be sustained.
Thanks, Molly. David, you're up next.
Thanks, AJ. And I am going to piggyback off Molly's comment entirely to highlight, I think the first point that I want to talk to, which Molly just highlighted really succinctly, was this context-specific responses. And I think when we talk about context, we're looking at the conflict context, the fragility landscape, the environmental context, and the mobility context. All of which are different and diverse and intersect in different ways, depending on the environment in which the setting in which it's unfolding. I think it's only through that type of robust context analysis at the local level that we'll develop responses that are cohesive and actually respond to localized dynamics on the ground. Secondly, I think I want to talk to the framing, and others have mentioned this. I think we increasingly see that this is framed from a securitized approach, and we see human mobility as a risk, and we really should shift towards seeing this type of mobility as an opportunity. And finally, I think system-wide coordination and a stronger focus on the integration of the peace building pillar. So we see increasingly that there is limited, or that there are limitations on the coordination mechanisms that are in place, and this is something that we need to be working harder on, and how we integrate the various different pillars across the humanitarian development and peace building nexus. So yeah, I think that really does cover it for me, except finally, I think, sorry, one other point that comes to mind is climate resilient durable solutions for displaced populations. It hasn't really been mentioned much in this particular session, but I think it's something that does come to mind as we talked, and it's increasingly relevant that we look at how we become climate resilient in our approach to durable solutions. Over.
Thanks, David. It's true. Good point. And last but certainly never least is Shana. Take us home, Shana.
Thank you. I mean, everything has already been said, I think, very, very robustly. I would just say that in the movement towards all of these complex solutions, that at the heart of it all, we're talking about individuals with their own complex issues as they are, moving through all of these different scenarios. And so as long as we're able to tether existing human rights and dignity rights approaches to all of these things, I think that we're headed in a much more positive direction. And I'll end there.
Thanks, everybody. And you did such a brilliant job of summarizing your own points that I don't think I need to do that. And we're perfectly on time. So I want to thank everybody for participating in this, especially our panelists for being here. A special thanks to our colleagues in the field who joined us despite bad internets and bad connections. So thank you to everybody. If you have any additional resources or email addresses that you want to share, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, the recording for this video will be available in about a week from now. Frederick, are there any other announcements related to the translations or anything that we need to say? No, perfect. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and it was nice to meet with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.